When the executive helicopter lost hydraulic pressure over the water, the pilot was hurt, the storm was closing, and the cabin behind me came apart in noise and panic. I was the man in the scuffed technical jacket, the single father they had called a hired wrench 3 hours earlier, and I climbed into the left seat and put my hands on the controls. Nobody in that aircraft believed I knew what I was doing. Nobody believed a maintenance specialist could hold a dying machine in the air. But when I set that helicopter down on a Marine Corps airfield, something stranger happened. The Marines on that flight line looked at my face, stopped moving, and went completely silent. If you want to know why those Marines recognized me, subscribe to the channel and stay for the reversal that left Preston Wexford with nothing to say. 3 hours before all of that, I parked my pickup at the far edge of the private pad that Carrington Aeronautical Systems kept outside Charleston, and I carried my tool case across the asphalt while the morning heat came up off the ground in slow waves. The case was old, scratched along one corner where it had ridden in truck beds for 11 years, and I had stopped caring how it looked a long time ago. I was there as an avionics specialist for a small contractor, sent to run a pre-flight systems check on an aircraft that belonged to people who would never learn my name. That was fine with me. My daughter Maren had a spelling test that afternoon, and I had promised her I would be home in time to hear her practice the hard ones. That promise was the only thing on my mind when I walked onto that pad. The contrast on that ramp was so complete it was almost theater. Evelyn Carrington arrived in a black sedan with 2 operations managers walking half a step behind her, and everything about her said that her time was measured in units the rest of us could not afford. She was 43 years old, chief executive of a company valued in the billions, and she moved like a woman whose calendar had been argued over by 6 people before breakfast. Preston Wexford came out of the second car in a suit that had been cut for his exact shoulders, and the ground staff swarmed him the way people swarm someone who signs things. Then there was me, in a work jacket with a torn cuff, holding a case with a bad hinge. Preston looked at me for 1 full second and filed me somewhere below the fuel truck. I did not resent it, because most people read a man in the first 3 seconds and spend the rest of the conversation defending that first impression. What I cared about was the diagnostic terminal, so I plugged in, pulled the log history, and walked backward through the aircraft's electronic memory the way I had done 1,000 times. Buried in a maintenance cycle from 9 days earlier was a hydraulic pressure caution that had appeared, held for a moment, and cleared itself with no corrective action recorded. That kind of warning does not comfort me, because a fault that goes away on its own has not gone anywhere at all. I ran the log forward and found the same event twice more, once 6 days back and once the previous evening during a ground run. Each time it lasted a few seconds. Each time the system returned to normal and nobody wrote a word about it, because a fault that clears itself leaves no scar for anyone in a hurry to notice. I know what an intermittent hydraulic caution usually means, and it almost never means the sensor is lying. It usually means a line, a seal, or a fitting is failing slowly, giving you polite little warnings until the day it stops being polite. I unplugged the terminal, wrote a grounding recommendation, and went looking for someone with the authority to stop a flight. Preston Wexford was standing near the aircraft nose with a phone against his ear, and he ended the call when he saw me coming, which I took as a small courtesy until he opened his mouth. I told him what I had found plainly without dressing it up. I said the aircraft had logged 3 intermittent hydraulic pressure cautions in 9 days, that the pattern suggested a developing leak rather than a sensor fault, and that I recommended grounding the aircraft for a full inspection of the hydraulic lines. I said it would take 4 hours if the parts were on hand. He listened to about half of it before his jaw set in a way I had seen on a lot of men who confuse patience with weakness. He asked me whether the panel showed a caution right then. I said it did not. He asked me whether the pilot had signed the aircraft as flyable. I said the pilot had. Then he gave me the sentence that I would remember for the rest of that day and probably the rest of my life. He said, "The computer says green, the pilot says it flies." What else do you want, exactly? There was a small crowd of ground staff within earshot, and I understood that some part of this was performance, a demonstration of who counted and who did not. I did not argue with him. Arguing with a man like that just gives him more surface to push against, and I had learned in another life that the only thing worth doing in that moment is stating the fact and letting it sit. So I said the only true thing I had. I told him, machinery doesn't care about your schedule. He went very still, and I watched something cold move behind his eyes, because a man who has never been told no by anyone below him hears that sentence as an insult rather than a warning. Then he told me I was paid to check equipment, not to decide the chief executive's itinerary. And he walked away toward the sedan. Evelyn Carrington heard the last part of it. I know she did, because she was standing 10 feet away with a folder in her hand, and she looked over at exactly the wrong moment for me and the right moment for the story. Later she would tell me what went through her head, and I have thought about it many times since because it was not malice. She saw a man in a torn jacket disagreeing with her executive vice president about an aircraft that 3 separate systems had already declared airworthy. She had a meeting in 90 minutes with a technology firm she intended to acquire before the markets closed, a deal her board had been circling for 11 months. She trusted her operations department. She trusted Preston, and she made the ordinary choice that people in tall buildings make every day. She trusted the structure instead of the man closest to the metal. I filed my report anyway because that is what you do when nobody listens. I logged into the maintenance terminal at 17 minutes past 10 in the morning and submitted a formal grounding recommendation with the 3 caution events attached, time-stamped, and flagged as inspection required. I did it knowing it would probably sit in a queue until Monday. Then I packed my case and walked back toward my truck while the ground crew rolled the aircraft out and the pilot started his own walk-around. I remember the sky to the southeast had that flat white look that means the air is not finished with you yet. I remember thinking about Marin's spelling list and the word she kept missing, which was necessary, with 1 letter and 2 of another that she could never keep straight. The pilot brought the rotor system up while I was still on the pad, and I stopped to watch the way I always do because a rotor coming to speed is one of the few things in this world that still makes me feel something clean. The diagnostic tablet was in my hand. I had not shut it down, and as the hydraulic pumps loaded, I watched the pressure caution flash on the screen for exactly 2 seconds and then vanish the way it had 3 times before, quiet as a hand slipping out of a pocket. 2 seconds. Nobody in the aircraft saw it. Nobody on the ramp saw it. I stood there in the rotor wash with a bad feeling settling into my chest like cold water, and then someone called my name across the pad. It was one of the operations managers, jogging, holding up a hand. Evelyn wanted a technical specialist on board to present the system's data at the destination, because the firm she was acquiring had raised questions about integration reliability, and she wanted somebody who could answer them from actual knowledge rather than from a prepared deck. The manager asked Preston who should go. Preston, standing right there, looked at me with the expression of a man handing a shovel to someone he has just insulted and said my name. So the same person he had dismissed as a hired wrench 10 minutes earlier was suddenly boarding a helicopter with the chief executive of a billion-dollar company, carrying a tool case he would not need and a warning nobody wanted. The pilot's name was Dylan Beckett, a civilian with maybe 9,000 hours and a calm, unhurried way of moving that I liked immediately. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, and he did the kind of walk-around that told me he had been doing this long enough to have been scared at least once. He nodded at me as I climbed in, glanced at the case, and made a joke about bringing my own parts. I sat in the rear-facing seat closest to the cockpit, and while the others were still settling, I did the thing I have never been able to stop doing. My eyes went to the collective, then the pedals, then across the instrument panel in the same sequence I had used 10,000 times, left to right, top to bottom, and my hand found the seat rail the way you check a door frame in a dark house. Dylan caught it. Pilots always catch it. He turned his head slightly and asked whether I had ever flown helicopters, and there was real curiosity in it, not challenge. 2 words came out of me before I decided to say them. Long time. He waited for more, the way people do, and when nothing else came, he nodded once and went back to his checklist, and that was the end of it. That was the first crack in the wall I had spent 7 years building, and I did not even notice it opening. Behind me, Preston was already talking about the acquisition timeline, loud enough that it was clearly meant to be overheard. We lifted off into that flat white sky and turned southwest along the coast, and for the first 20 minutes it was an ordinary flight with ordinary people saying ordinary things. Preston filled the cabin with a monologue about ambition, aimed at nobody and at me specifically, about how the difference between people who rise and people who plateau is nothing but appetite. He said some men reach 40 and simply decide that comfort is enough, and he said it while looking at a fixed 0.6 inches to the left of my head. I have been condescended to by professionals, and Preston was at best an enthusiastic amateur. I let it go past me. Evelyn, to her credit, looked faintly embarrassed by it. She asked me a question then, and I think she meant it kindly, though it landed on the same nerve. She asked why a man with my depth of systems knowledge had never moved into management, why I was still crawling into equipment bays at 40 when I clearly understood the aircraft better than the people who bought them. I thought about the honest answer, which involved a hospital hallway, a folded flag, and a 5-year-old girl who would not sleep unless the hall light was on. What I said instead was simple. Some things matter more than a title. Evelyn looked at me for a moment longer than she needed to, and I could see her filing the answer somewhere she would come back to later. Then I felt it through the floor, a vibration that did not belong, low and rhythmic, coming up through the seat frame into the base of my spine, and it was not the rotor and it was not the transmission. It was the feel of a system working harder than it should to do a job it had done easily an hour before. I leaned forward until I could see the instrument panel between the seats, and I found the hydraulic pressure indication. The needle was not steady. It was moving, a small oscillation a few units down and back, like a pulse in a wrist you are not sure you should be worried about. Dylan's shoulders had changed. He had seen it too. Preston did not feel any of it, or if he did, he had already decided it was somebody else's category. He leaned into the space between the seats and told Dylan we had 20 minutes and that the market closed at 4 and that the other side would take a delay as a signal of weakness. Dylan did not answer him. I did. I said, "We may not have 20 minutes." Preston turned on me with that particular flair of a man who has just realized the person he insulted is now the person talking about survival, and before he could assemble a reply, the aircraft answered for me. The master caution light came on, amber and steady and utterly indifferent to everyone's calendar. The weather in front of us had thickened fast the way coastal weather does, a gray wall stacking up over the water with the light going strange and green underneath it, and Dylan was already calling a turn to route around it. That is when the hydraulic pressure fell. It did not fall gently. It dropped through a third of its range in about 4 seconds. Held there long enough for my stomach to understand what was happening, and then climbed halfway back, which is the cruelest thing a failing system can do because it invites you to hope. I knew then, with complete certainty, that the intermittent caution on the ground had never been a sensor problem. Something in that hydraulic circuit had been leaking for 9 days, and the flight loads had just finished the job that time had started. Dylan was fighting it. I could see it in the tendons of his forearms. When hydraulic assistance degrades in an aircraft like that, the control forces stop being suggestions and start being labor, and every input costs you strength you were not budgeting to spend. He got the nose back where he wanted it and held a shallow descent to get us under the worst of the weather. And for maybe 40 seconds it looked survivable in the ordinary way. Then we hit a downdraft on the leading edge of the storm cell. The floor dropped out from under us, and the aircraft fell far enough that everything unsecured in the cabin came up off the deck. Dylan's shoulder slammed into the edge of his seat frame with a sound I felt in my own teeth. I heard him make a noise, short and wrong, and when the aircraft steadied I saw that his right arm had gone loose against his side. He was still flying. He was flying with his left hand and a great deal of stubbornness, and his right hand was on the cyclic but not gripping it, just resting there like a hand on a table. His face had gone gray under the sweat. I had my harness off before I had made any conscious decision about it, and I came forward between the seats and got myself into the left-hand position, which is a thing you should never do in a helicopter that is already losing control authority, and which I did anyway. Dylan turned his head and looked at me. He asked the question directly, 3 words, and there was no politeness left in it at all. "You know how to fly?" I did not answer him, because the answer was long and this was not the hour for it. Instead, I asked him the only question that mattered in the flat, stripped-down cadence of a language I had not spoken out loud in 7 years. "How much hydraulic assist do you have left?" He blinked once. I saw the recognition land on him, and it was not recognition of my face. It was recognition of a rhythm, the way a musician hears another musician tune up. Technicians do not ask that question in that order, in that voice. "Half on the number 2 system. Dropping," he said. "Number 1's gone. Controls are heavy and getting heavier." I put my hands on the controls and something happened to me that I had not felt since I was 33 years old. My shoulders came down. My breathing lengthened. The noise in the cabin behind me stopped being noise and became information I could either use or ignore. The quiet man who fixed circuit boards for a living in South Carolina went somewhere else, and in his place was somebody I thought I had buried, and my hands knew the machine before my mind finished agreeing to it. I took it. "I have the aircraft," I said, and I heard my own voice come back to me from a long way away. The first thing I did was nothing. That is the part nobody understands about a machine that is coming apart around you. Every instinct in a frightened body says do something large and do it now, and every large, fast input you make in a degraded helicopter spends control authority you cannot get back. So I held what I had, let the aircraft tell me what it wanted to do, and learned it in the only classroom available. It wanted to roll slightly right. It resisted left pedal. It had a delay of nearly a full second between what I asked and what it delivered, which meant I had to fly the aircraft I would have in 1 second rather than the one I had at that instant. I set a shallow descent, brought the speed back into the band where the machine was easiest to hold, and stopped asking it for anything clever. Then I started giving orders because in an emergency, people who have something to do are people who are not screaming. I told Dylan to stay in his seat, keep his harness locked, and read me pressures and altitude every 15 seconds. Nothing else, no advice, no opinions on my flying. I told Evelyn to secure everything loose in the cabin, get the papers and the cases under the seats or behind the netting, and then get her harness as tight as it would go and put her feet flat on the floor. I told Preston to do the same and to stop talking. Evelyn moved immediately. That surprised me, and it was the first thing about her I genuinely respected. Preston found his voice again about 90 seconds later, and what he found was fear dressed as authority. He wanted the nearest civil airport, he named it, and he told me to turn toward it in the tone of a man who has never had an instruction declined. I looked at where that field sat and I told him no. The approach ran over 11 miles of dense urban ground, and I had an aircraft with one hydraulic system dead, a second one bleeding, and a control response that was degrading fast enough that I could measure it between one input and the next. If it quit over houses, it would not just be 4 of us. He said the thing he thought would end the conversation. "This is a Carrington aircraft." I did not raise my voice. "I have found that you almost never need to." I said, "Right now it's an aircraft in distress. There's no chief executive on board, no vice president, and no technician. There's a pilot and 3 passengers, and I'm the pilot." That was the moment the power in that cabin changed hands, and everyone in it felt the change, including me. Preston sat back. He did not say another word for 11 minutes. Behind his fear, I could already see something else assembling itself, the beginning of a story in which none of this was his fault, but I did not have the room to worry about it yet. I ran the map in my head, and the map in my head was older and better than it had any right to be. Coastal South Carolina, southwest of Charleston, 100 degrees of ocean to my left and marsh and pine to my right, and one field within reach that had 11,000 feet of runway, a full crash and rescue detachment, and controllers who would clear everything out of my way in under a minute if I gave them the right words. Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort. I said the name out loud so Dylan could confirm the bearing, and I heard my own voice hesitate for about a quarter of a second on the word Marine, which is a thing that had not happened to me in years. I got on the radio at 12 miles. My voice changed the instant I keyed the microphone, and there was nothing I could do about it, because the phrasing you learn under pressure at 25 years old is welded to you forever. Short, flat, front-loaded with the things that matter. I declared the emergency, gave the aircraft type and registration, gave the failure, gave my position and my intentions, and asked for the longest surface they had with rescue equipment standing by. The controller came back fast and clean, and there was a beat of silence at the end of his transmission that I did not have time to think about. Then he asked me for the number of people on board. 4 souls, I said. The hydraulic pressure kept walking down. At 9 miles, I had to use both hands on the cyclic to hold a heading, and the aircraft had developed a slow right drift that I was correcting continuously rather than occasionally, which is how you know you are approaching the end of what the machine will give you. I understood by then that I was going to get one approach. Not one good approach and a go-around if it looked wrong. 1. If I arrived high or fast or misaligned, I would not have the control authority to fix it and come back around, and the difference between a landing and a crash would be measured in whether I had made my mistakes early enough to correct them gradually. So I started my descent absurdly early and made it absurdly shallow. spending distance instead of control inputs because distance was the only currency I had left. Preston chose that moment to reach for his phone. He wanted his assistant. He wanted the corporate counsel. He wanted the communications director, and he was saying all three names in a rising voice while I was flying an aircraft with 14% hydraulic assistance toward a runway I could not miss. Evelyn turned around in her seat and told him to shut his mouth. She did not say it the way executives say things. She said it the way a person says it, and it was the first entirely honest sentence I heard from anyone in that cabin. He put the phone down. She turned back and watched me fly, and something in her face reorganized itself permanently in those seconds. There was a keychain in my jacket pocket. Marin made it in the 3rd grade out of yellow and blue plastic cord, uneven, with a knot at the top she was proud of, and it has ridden in that pocket every working day since. In the descent, it started to vibrate against my chest in time with the airframe, a small, insistent tapping. And at 7 miles I looked down at the shape of it. For exactly 1 second, I did not think about my wife. I did not think about the ocean under us. I thought about a 9-year-old at a kitchen table with a spelling list, and then I put my eyes back on the instruments and I did not look down again. The last 400 feet were the longest of my life. I brought the descent rate down gradually, using distance the way I had planned to, and the aircraft got heavier in my hands with every foot, so that by the end I was flying with my shoulders and my back and not just my arms. Altitude peeled away, the runway filled the windscreen. Nobody in that cabin made a sound, and the only thing left in the world was the rotor and the wind and the numbers Dylan was reading in a voice that had gone very quiet. I did not attempt a hover. A hover would have killed us. I flew it onto the surface with a little forward speed, the way you do when the machine can no longer promise you anything, and I let the skids find the concrete. They found it hard. The aircraft settled, skidded forward maybe 40 feet with a long scraping shriek, yawed about 15 degrees to the left, and stopped. Nothing exploded, nothing burned. There was no fire and no blood and no cinematic wreckage, just a helicopter sitting slightly crooked on a runway with its rotor winding down and 4 people inside it breathing. I went through the shutdown by muscle memory, fuel, switches, battery, and then the rotor noise dropped away into that enormous silence that follows, and I heard Evelyn Carrington exhale like a person surfacing from deep water. She said, very quietly, that she did not believe it. I do not think she meant the landing. I think she meant being alive. Preston had his harness off before the blade stopped. He was out the cabin door and moving away from the aircraft at a pace just short of running, and he did not look back at any of us, and I noticed that, and so did Evelyn. I stayed in my seat. Dylan's shoulder was clearly dislocated or close to it, and he had gone the color of ash, so I got out of the left seat, got his harness released, told him not to move his arm, and waved the medical crew forward through the door. He grabbed my sleeve with his good hand as they came up the steps and said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm the avionics guy." He laughed, and it turned into something else halfway through. I climbed down onto the runway with my legs shaking underneath me the way they always do after, and that is when the second half of the day started. A Marine in a flightline vest was standing about 15 feet from the nose, with a headset in his hand, part of the crew that had come out to secure the aircraft, and he was looking at me the way you look at a word you cannot quite read. I was walking past him. He was still looking, and then his hand opened and the headset hit the concrete and he did not bend down to pick it up. His name was Caleb Voss. He had been a corporal the last time I saw him, in a hangar in a place neither of us likes to name, and he was a gunnery sergeant now with 11 years of additional weather on his face, and he had been a crew chief in my unit for 2.5 years. He said it like a question with the bottom falling out of it. Major Hale. I stopped walking. Everything in me wanted to say he had the wrong man, because I had said versions of that sentence for 7 years to people at hardware stores and school events who half recognized something, and it had always worked. It did not work on Caleb Voss because Caleb Voss had strapped me into aircraft. Before I could answer him, another voice came from my left, and this one did not have any question in it at all. Colonel Elias Boone had come out of the operations building with the group that responds when somebody declares an emergency, and he had crossed maybe half the distance to the aircraft when he saw my face and stopped walking mid-stride. I had flown with Boone when he was a captain. He was heavier now, and grayer, and had a colonel's eagles on his collar, and he stood in the middle of that flight line and stared at me while everyone around him noticed that their colonel had stopped moving. Then he said my full rank and name out loud the way you say something to make it real. Major Rowan Hale, here is what I have to explain, because otherwise it sounds like a story that flatters me. Most of the Marines out there did not know me. They were 22 years old and I had been gone for 7 years and my face meant nothing to them. But two things happened at once. A gunnery sergeant dropped his headset and a colonel stopped dead. And when those two people react that way to a civilian in a torn work jacket, everyone on a flight line looks up. And then somebody said the name to somebody else. And among the older crews there was a second recognition, the slower kind, because that name is attached to a training accident many years ago in which an aircraft lost most of its hydraulics and got put on the ground with everyone alive. That event became a case study. They still teach it. Boone came the rest of the way and put his hand out. He was smiling, but there was something else underneath it, some complicated thing about time passing. I never thought I'd see the day you'd bring somebody else's broken helicopter down onto my ramp. I took his hand and I told him the truth, which was, I didn't plan on coming back like this. Behind me I could hear Evelyn Carrington being helped down out of the cabin, and I knew without turning around that she had heard the rank, the name, and every word after it. Preston Wexford had heard it too. He was standing about 30 feet away with his phone in his hand and his face the color of wet paper, and the man he had called a hired wrench 4 hours earlier had just been addressed by a Marine colonel as Major. That was not the end of it. Caleb Voss had walked over to the aircraft while we talked and he was doing what crew chiefs do, which is look under things. He came back wiping his fingers on a rag, and he was not looking at me the way people look at a legend. He was looking at me the way one working man looks at another when he has just seen the arithmetic. He said, "You lost hydraulics again?" I said, "Most of it. Number 1 gone, number 2 down to about 14% on short final." He looked at the helicopter for a long moment. Then he looked back at me. He said, "And you put it down in one piece." Nobody answered him. That second silence was heavier than the first, because the first one had been about a name and this one was about the machine sitting behind us with its skids scraped and its passengers alive. Every person on that line who understood aircraft was doing the same calculation Caleb had just done, and the answer kept coming out the same way. Evelyn stood at the edge of it with her jacket in her hand and her hair pulled loose by the rotor wash, and she was not looking at the helicopter at all. She was looking at me, and I could see her rebuilding the entire morning from the ground up, starting with a conversation on a ramp near Charleston that she had chosen not to interrupt. Preston Wexford is not a stupid man. That was always the problem with him. He had roughly 4 minutes standing on that runway to understand that there was going to be an investigation, that an investigation would go looking for the cause of the hydraulic failure, and that the cause would lead directly to a technician's warning that he had personally overruled in front of witnesses. He understood that the story now had a hero in it, and that heroes make the people who ignored them look exactly like what they are. So he did the thing that men in his position have done for as long as there have been positions. He got out in front of it, and he did it loudly, and he did it in a place where he thought volume would still work. He walked over to where Evelyn was standing with Colonel Boone and 2 base personnel, and he started talking before he arrived. He said that he wanted it noted formally that a contract employee with no authorization had left his seat during flight, entered the cockpit, and assumed control of a Carrington aircraft. He said that this employee had concealed a piloting background from the company, that no one on board had been able to verify his qualifications or currency, and that it was entirely possible his intervention had worsened an already serious situation. He said it with real conviction, even managed a note of regret as though it pained him to raise it. I did not defend myself. I have never once in my life won an argument by being the loudest man in it, and besides, I could see the only door in the room and it was not made of words. I waited until he finished and then I asked him a question in front of all of them, quietly. "Do you remember what I said to you before we took off?" He turned toward me with the confidence of a man who has already decided what the record says. He told them I had mentioned some minor sensor caution of no consequence, that the aircraft had been signed off by maintenance, cleared by the pilot, and showed green on every panel, and that no reasonable person would have grounded a flight over it. So I looked at Evelyn Carrington, and I gave her the only thing I had. I said, "I filed a formal grounding recommendation at 10:17 this morning. 3 intermittent hydraulic pressure cautions over 9 days, attached, time-stamped, flagged inspection required." The runway got very quiet. Evelyn turned her head toward Preston and did not say anything at all, which was somehow worse than if she had. And Preston, who had come too far to stop, said the sentence that finished him, although he would not know it for another 2 hours. He said that no such report existed, that he had reviewed the maintenance queue himself, and that if I had submitted anything of the kind, it would be in the system. Except that I install and maintain those diagnostic systems for a living, and he does not. So I told him something he did not know about his own company's equipment. Every maintenance terminal on that contract synchronizes a redundant copy of each submitted report to the manufacturer's server, off-site, outside Carrington's network, on a rolling schedule, because the manufacturer needs fleet-wide fault data for warranty and reliability tracking. Nobody at Carrington can edit that copy. Most people at Carrington do not know it exists. I also told them that the caution events themselves were still recorded in the aircraft's own memory, sitting 40 feet behind us with its skids on the concrete. Colonel Boone had been listening to all of this with his arms folded, and he stepped in at exactly the right moment. He said that an aircraft in distress had landed on his installation, that the site was now his responsibility until the civil authorities took it, and that the aircraft was not to be entered, powered, downloaded, or approached by anyone from Carrington Aeronautical Systems until the investigators arrived. He said it in a completely flat voice, and then he detailed 2 Marines to stand at the aircraft. That was the moment Preston Wexford stopped having options. He could not touch the helicopter, he could not reach the manufacturer's server, and he was standing on federal property surrounded by people who write everything down. Evelyn turned to him then. She had gone somewhere very cold, and I watched a woman who runs 11,000 employees make a decision in real time. She said, "Preston, if that report doesn't exist, you have nothing to worry about." She let that sit for a second. Then she said the rest of it. "And if it does exist, then you don't need to worry about who Rowan Hale used to be. You need to worry about what you did this morning." It took the technical team about 2 hours to confirm the first half of it. The aircraft's onboard maintenance memory had recorded hydraulic pressure anomalies on 3 separate occasions over 9 days, including one during the ground run the previous evening and one lasting 2 seconds during rotor engagement on the morning of the flight. The physical inspection found a failed fitting on a hydraulic line with witness marks indicating a slow weep that had been developing for a considerable time. In other words, the aircraft had been telling anyone who cared to look that it was going to do exactly what it did, and it had been saying so for more than a week. It had said it one last time for 2 seconds while I stood on the ramp and watched. The second half took Evelyn's internal counsel about the same amount of time, and it was worse for Preston than the aircraft was. The manufacturer's server had my report exactly where I said it would be, submitted at 10:17 in the morning, flagged inspection required, with the 3 caution events attached. It had been routed automatically to 2 addresses, one of which was Preston Wexford's. 11 minutes later, at 10:28, he had replied. The reply was 4 words long, and by that evening those 4 words had been read aloud in a conference room in Charleston by a lawyer who did not enjoy reading them. "Proceed. Executive schedule takes priority." Then his assistant at 10:31 had changed the report status in the maintenance system from inspection required to operational review pending. That is not deletion. It does not look like anything at all in a log. But an inspection required flag places an automatic hold on the aircraft's dispatch authorization, and an operational review pending flag does not. And so with 3 keystrokes, the only mechanism that would have kept that helicopter on the ground was quietly switched off. The assistant, interviewed later, said she had been told it was a scheduling correction. I believe her. That is how these things actually happen in offices, by people who are not thinking about hydraulic fittings at all. He tried one last argument in that conference room, and it was the argument such men always reach for. He said that thousands of aircraft fly every single day with minor technical cautions logged against them, that if every intermittent indication grounded a fleet, nothing would ever leave the ground, and that hindsight makes prudence out of what was, at the time, a routine operational judgment. It is not even a bad argument in the abstract. Evelyn Carrington let him finish it completely. Then she asked him one question, and I have thought about the economy of it many times since. She said, "And how many of those flights needed a former Marine major to keep the chief executive from going into the ocean?" Evelyn suspended him that night from all executive responsibility connected to aviation operations pending the board's investigation. There were no handcuffs. Nobody was dragged out of a building. The acquisition closed 9 days later without him in the room, which I think wounded him more than anything else, and the board's review took 4 months and ended his career at Carrington in a press release of 2 paragraphs that did not use the word dismissed. The punishment arrived through the only channel that could reach him. It came for the things he had actually valued, which were the office, the name on the door, and the assumption that his judgment outranked the machinery. She found me later that first evening in the medical section on the base, where a corpsman had decided that my hands would not stop shaking and that I ought to sit down about it. Dylan was 2 rooms over with his shoulder immobilized, telling anyone who came within range about the approach. Evelyn came in still wearing the same clothes, holding 2 paper cups of terrible coffee, and she sat down across from me and asked the question she had been holding since a Marine dropped a headset on the flight line. She asked why a man with my record had spent 7 years letting people assume he was nobody in particular. So I told her. I told her that for 11 years the Marine Corps had every part of me that mattered, that I had been an instructor pilot, that I had loved it in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have not had a thing like that. I told her about the training accident that made my name into a case study, and how little it had felt like heroism at the time, and how much it had felt like arithmetic. And then I told her that my wife died in the spring of a year I do not say out loud, and that afterward there was a 5-year-old girl in a house who had exactly 1 parent left, and that the Marine Corps needed me somewhere else at least 200 days a year. Then she offered me a job. Not a technician's job. She wanted to build a flight safety and airworthiness function at Carrington that reported directly to her, outside of operations with authority to ground aircraft, and she wanted me to run it. She was not being sentimental about it, and I respect her for that. She said she had watched her own company nearly kill her because a system had been built in which the person with the most relevant knowledge had the least standing to act on it, and she said she was not interested in fixing that with a memorandum. I did not accept on the spot. This is not the kind of story where a poor man suddenly becomes rich, and I would not tell it if it were. What actually mattered to me was much narrower than money, and I told her exactly what it was. I said I would come in and discuss it, seriously, on one condition. The next time a technician tells you an aircraft shouldn't fly, the chief executive hears that before she hears the schedule, not after, not as a note in a summary. She said yes without hesitating, and then she said something I did not expect, which was that she had heard me say almost that exact thing on a ramp near Charleston at 9 in the morning, and had chosen the calendar anyway, and that she intended to remember it. We shook on it. I have found her to be a person who keeps her word, which is rarer than competence. They drove me toward the gate a little after 8 that evening. Caleb Voss and Colonel Boone were waiting near the vehicle, which I had a strong suspicion was not a coincidence, and the 3 of us stood there in the last of the light with the flight line stretching away behind them. Boone asked me the question he had clearly been carrying around all afternoon. He said, "You really don't miss it." I looked past him at the ramp, where 2 crews were turning aircraft in the blue-dark rotors coming up to speed. That sound rolling across the concrete and into my chest the way it has since I was 24 years old. I did not lie to him. I told him of course I miss it. Some days I miss it so much I have to go stand in the yard. Then my phone rang in my pocket, and the name on it was Marin, and everything on that flight line got very small and very far away. I held up one finger to a Marine colonel, which I would not have dared to do in another life, and I answered it, "Hey, kiddo." She wanted to know why I was late and whether I had remembered that necessary has 1 C and 2 S's, and I told her I had remembered, and that I was on my way, and that I would tell her about my day when I got home. I did not tell her about my day for another 2 years. I walked to the car with the phone against my ear and got in. Behind me, Caleb Voss stood watching the car pull away, and he asked Colonel Boone the question that I think is the actual center of this whole thing. He asked, "Do you think he knew somebody here would recognize him when he put it down?" Boone watched the taillights go toward the gate for a while before he answered. He said no, and then he said the rest of it. That's exactly why Rowan Hale is Rowan Hale. I was not there to hear it, and I have only Caleb's word for it, and Caleb has never lied to me about anything that mattered. Because the truth is that I did not come back for the rank, or the recognition, or to be addressed by a title I stopped using 7 years ago. I came back because there were 4 people in an aircraft that was coming apart, and because a 9-year-old girl in South Carolina had a spelling test she wanted to practice, and because the only thing I have ever really been trying to do since the spring my wife died is get home. The Marines on that flight line saw a major. Evelyn Carrington saw a leader she had overlooked. Preston Wexford saw the end of his career walking toward him in a torn work jacket. What I was the entire time was a father driving home with a keychain made of yellow and blue cord in his pocket, and that was always enough.